Good evening, welcome to the Frontline Club and Happy New Year. I'd like to thank all the members on behalf of my wife and myself for the support they've given us over our relationship with WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. But I'd like to take the opportunity to express that not all our members necessarily agree with us about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and I think that's important to note. But despite that, we're still getting people's support. It's very important to the Frontline Club, and the one thing I think unites members is that we believe it's central to debate these issues, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to do that tonight, and we'll do it again. In addition to that, on the 19th, Wednesday the 19th of January, there's going to be an event here where I'm going to invite members, but only those who've actually paid up fully, to come and discuss these matters and give them an opportunity to air their views where they differ from ours, and perhaps talk about in more detail what ours are. And we don't normally hold members-only events, so it's quite unique. It's not really what we're about. We're more about these events with the general public as well. But anyway, please come if you would like to discuss these important matters. So again, I'll thank you for coming, and I'm going to hand over to Richard and thank the panel for coming to debate this issue.
Thank you, Vaughn. My name is Richard Gizbert. I've been asked to chair this panel. I host a media watch show on Al Jazeera English called The Listening Post, and I'm grateful that our panelists are here. Starting at the opposite end, Mark Stevens, a face that if you didn't know before this story, you've come to know now. Julian Assange's solicitor. We've got Gavin MacFayden, who's here with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. They've done some work alongside WikiLeaks along the way. David Aaronovitch, who is with The Times, a writer, broadcaster, and commentator. And we've got Katz, deputy editor of The Guardian, someone who's obviously in pole position to tell us a few things about WikiLeaks and its relationship with the mainstream media. First of all, I just want to remind everybody to either kill your cell phones or put them on stun, please, so we're not interrupted by chirping electronics. What we're trying to do tonight with this discussion, and I'd like to characterize it as a discussion. It doesn't necessarily have to be a debate. The Frontline Club is about journalism. It is not a club that was formed to discuss the intricacies of extradition treaties or to look into allegations of one form of assault or another. Those issues have really trumped in many ways in the mainstream media's coverage of WikiLeaks over the last few weeks. And what we're trying to accomplish tonight is to get this discussion back into the area of journalism, the impact that this organization has had on the way journalism is conducted in 2011. We're going to start with the panel. We'll see how long the panel can keep things lively. We'll eventually go to the audience for questions. But I would just ask that we focus on journalism, because that's where we want to bring the discussion tonight. Ian, I want to start with you, because much has been written and said about the relationship between The Guardian and WikiLeaks, which I suppose, like any marriage, has grown complicated in the early months. And it's a fascinating story to anyone who's read the various, well, Nick Davies had the piece that he posted last week. The Vanity Fair piece is very interesting as well. And there's clearly been a falling out of some kind between the organizations. And what I'd like to know is, having had a ringside seat for some of that, whether you see this as being a byproduct of some of the personalities involved, which often happens in the news business, or was this a conflict of cultures? A startup web organization dealing in unrefined data, finding itself in a relationship with a mainstream media organization. How do you see it?
I think I preferred the characterization of complicated to the falling out. And I think I might start not by talking about the complicated bit, but by the bit that came before the complicated bit, because Mark was there about 3 months ago when we sat down with Julian.
And boy, were we loved up.
I think it was a sort of 6-hour session, or maybe more, with Julian and journalists from Spiegel, and actually it was just Spiegel at that meeting, where we collectively came up with this plan to publish the cables simultaneously between not just the 3, Spiegel, New York Times, and The Guardian, who had done the war logs releases over the summer, but additionally, because Julian was keen to have European partners, Le Monde and El País. And if you said to me, take a bet right then on whether this alliance between 6 different organisations on 3 time zones, 4 languages, 3 different publication schedules, conventional old media with sort of information libertarian new media was going to hold together for 2 months or 1 month. I'm not sure I'd have taken that bet. And I think we should step back a little bit from what you refer to as the complications and just acknowledge that actually there was a really rather remarkable collaboration that held for several months and produced, I think, some really remarkable journalism. And I think coming to the culture difference that you allude to, what was interesting about the collaboration, of course, the culture difference produced its frictions, but it also produced something really valuable, I think. And I think what happened is that the 2 sides, by which I mean WikiLeaks and traditional media, if you like, both brought something quite different to the table. WikiLeaks brought, for starters, obviously this extraordinary trove of information. They brought, and this is not at all insignificant, the ability to publish that information beyond the reach of any jurisdiction, so that whatever attempts any country might have made to suppress publication by one of the conventional partners, they would have known that the stuff would come out through WikiLeaks. I think that's quite significant. And they brought some quite considerable understanding of how to work with data and big databases. And for our part, I think we brought very old-fashioned skills of how to look at stuff and sort the wheat from the chaff and work out what's significant and what's of public interest and what's not. And by the way, quite substantial resources in terms of bodies. I mean, one of the things that I think people don't have a sense of is quite the sheer scale of journalistic effort that has gone into the cable story. I mean, I was trying to tot it up on my way here today and thinking we had at least 30, probably nudging 40 reporters.
That's the liar buzzer. 20 maybe? Maybe 20?
I thought it was the Pentagon.
It's not the Pentagon.
If you really push me, I'll list them.
There will be no list.
Okay, I am listing them.
Okay.
So you know, real scale. I think we brought a sort of ability to project and dramatise this material. And really significantly, I think we brought the ability to go through this vast mass of material and... Oh, fuck off. Where was I?
Vast mass of material.
I think we brought the ability to go through this stuff and work out what was threatening to sources and how we could protect sources and release material in a way that was really safe for sources. And I think finally on the sort of culture point, I think what was really interesting is that during the period that we've worked with them, just over the last year, because we worked with WikiLeaks quite a lot before last year, I think I think there's a bit from each organisation that's rubbed off, if you like, on the others. And I think that from our point of view, we started the summer with WikiLeaks releasing a vast number of Afghan war logs, completely unredacted, placing essentially sort of purist commitment to releasing information ahead of other considerations like potential risks associated with the documents. And we ended in a situation where they essentially subcontracted to us, more or less, the redaction of documents so that they would be safe and not put sources at risk. I think it's quite a significant change in the culture of WikiLeaks, actually, over that period. The complications that came at the end of it, I think, have as much to do, to be honest, with a situation where you're in a collaboration with it, where a collaborator becomes the story. And I think it's very difficult to report objectively on the story and have a collaboration running in parallel without a few bits of broken crockery. And I think that there have been so few bits of broken crockery is a miracle.
Mark, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree with Ian. I mean, I think there has been a major change in the way in which this has gone forward, and I think it's gone forward remarkably evenly, despite... it's one of those things that if you have a family, you can have quite straightforward conversations, but actually people don't take umbrage. It's the people around the penumbra that do, and I think that that's really what's happened here as far as I see it. And I think that there has been a significant change. I mean, I think that WikiLeaks has been responsible, very responsible, in the way in which it has gone forward with the redactions process. I mean, even I would go back even further than the Cablegate, but I'd go back to, you know, the war logs and before. You know, actually nobody's been harmed by the publication of this material, and that raises a very important question for me, because, you know, the question is, has this material been overclassified? And if you look at the amount of material which is being classified by states, it's gone up in a sort of almost vertical graph. It's gone up by, you know, a sort of 9 times. And that's a massive change in the way in which the state is behaving. And of course, I think the third estate then has to behave and react accordingly. And I think it has. And I think it's benefited society more generally.
Feel free to chime in, gentlemen, but David, I'm just wondering, you spent some time with The Guardian, did you not?
Yeah.
So that now you're at the Times, you're looking at this from a bit of a distance, but you still have friends there. Mm-hmm. When you saw the collaboration occur initially, what did you see coming of that?
Well, I mean, I'm in a bit of a dilemma, because insofar as I say anything nice about it, then I'm being creepy, and insofar as I say anything disobliging, then I'm being jealous. So I'll try to be equally creepy and jealous. I mean, essentially, Ian's story is the story of how he and The Guardian tamed the WikiLeaks beast. That's essentially the narrative you've heard. Let's kind of spool back and say what the essence of this is. What the essence of this is that a single American soldier, probably, by an incredible coup de main, delivered to this extraordinary organisation, WikiLeaks, a vast information dump. As far as we know, it's a one-off. So if you ask me what the long-term impact of WikiLeaks is, I would say, and I think Ian would probably agree, it's too early to tell. We don't know if any significant further document dumps like that exist. The Guardian, just like the Times, went nowhere to get that information other than to approach Assange once it was clear that he already had access to some documentation, and from that moment acted as a kind of gatekeeper for the information getting out there, and that is essentially the kind of taming bit. Mark says that WikiLeaks was already well able to do what Julian Assange described to me as harm immunisation. The whole Vanity Fair article says something entirely different, and it's largely sourced from The Guardian, says actually the harm immunisation capacity of WikiLeaks, yeah, probably completely sourced. There are a couple of quotes from New York Times people, etc., says that the harm immunisation process was virtually non-existent, and that all that was put in place. So the conventional media became the gatekeepers. Now the problem for the WikiLeaks stand is that Assange's claim was precisely that. This was information unmediated. That was the point about it. It was going to go out and you were going to decide. This was absolutely the new thing. What the gatekeeper then comes in as a result of his own kind of needs for it and so on, and then makes claims for itself. But what I find really interesting about it, in all kinds of ways, for its value, for its lack of value, for the things that are good about it, the things that are bad about it, all kinds of issues about what citizens may and should want about information and how information is made available and so on. But from a journalist point of view, how this relationship set up is really very interesting. I don't know whether people here are conversant with the book by Janet Malcolm, The Journalist and the Murderer. And what she says, her opening sentence is, all good journalists know in their hearts that what they do is indefensible, morally indefensible. In other words, in order to get the story that you want, eventually, you will tell anything to anybody. And the funny thing in the Vanity Fair story is that's exactly what The Guardian does to Assange. It plays him until the point where he gets too difficult for them, and then they effectively betray him. That's essentially what happens to the outside. I mean, we have a kind of code in journalism that says that's not what we do, because you have the information by a third party. But nevertheless, you couldn't have got to those stories that quickly if it hadn't been for the original dump, which you'd had, for documentation, which you'd had as the consequence of a particular agreement that you'd made. So that's interesting too. I wonder, under those circumstances, whether the next WikiLeaks organisation is going to come back to look for that form of collaboration with a media organisation which has its own impulsions and its own reasons and needs for doing things, or whether they will fight shy and they really will go more for their own organisation and their own unmediated documentation drop. But as I say, we've only really seen one of these. We're promised, and Mark may know more about this than I do, the great bank docu-drop, which comes from somewhere else, and when it comes, we'll have a look at that and see whether actually it was a flash in the pan, or whether it's something much more significant.
Let me say that from what I know of the dump in itself, that is, there's a kind of tsunami of paper, and since 2007, WikiLeaks has attracted all sorts of sources from everywhere in the world that you can imagine. I mean, they've already published significant material from Kenya, from South Africa, from a number of places we all know about. Some of them have had extraordinary effects on governments. However, that because of all the stuff that's happened here and all the controversy and the legal fights and the financial difficulties, there's been very little attempt to draw into the previous and now ongoing rush of documents piling up like some wave behind them, which they can't deal with. They just simply don't have the resources and people to deal with it. But I can assure you that if there's something in the order of 10 or 12 million documents, probably, that would be probably correct. I don't know. I mean, I don't think they've even been counted yet. But that's ongoing every day. So, as an ongoing phenomena, I have no doubt whatsoever that this model, which is, after all, if we go back to basics, a safe place for people with a crisis of conscience. It's a safe place to leave documents. It's a safe place to bring your concerns to the attention of a public. And in that respect, it's clearly the most successful whistleblowing defense organization we've ever seen. There's never been anything like it, with all its failings, and it has them, with all its personal difficulties, and it has them. It still is, without a doubt, the most effective way of bringing injustice and corruption to the public fore. They do more in one day than most newspapers do in 10 years. That's literally true.
I think that one of the things quite interesting is that David fingers some quite interesting issues, and I have a tendency to agree with some of what he says. But I think one thing which is overlooked largely is the parish pump heresy in all of this. And it manifests itself in two ways. The first is that people have a tendency, by their nature, to look at things in a very domestic terms. And I think they do in terms of WikiLeaks, and I think Gavin makes that point. I mean, the Peruvian government were felled by documents that come out of WikiLeaks. Nobody reports that because it doesn't fit the paradigm which we're currently looking at. The other thing that I think the other part of the parish pump heresy is the fact that the media is excoriating itself over this. I think Ian was absolutely right at the beginning. He says there has been probably the most impressive selection of journalism that's come out of these the stories which emanate from WikiLeaks, not just the cables, but stuff before as well. The most telling. We've actually got to the truth as members of the public for the very first time on a whole raft of issues. And I think that what we should be looking at is the diplomatic problems. It's actually the diplomats and the way in which they dissemble to us, and the fact that they are actually lying and deceiving members of the public. I think that's the real story at the back of this, and it's not really about journalism. If you go back to journalism, those that are on the inside, those people that sit in this room, know that journalism isn't pretty, and what we're seeing is an unvarnished version of journalism.
Just to say, I agree with what Ian had said largely about their initial relationship with The Guardian. It was an incredibly progressive one. It had never happened before. And I doubt if it'll happen quite the same way again in the future, but it certainly was a unique and wonderful collaboration. And documents got to the public in ways which they never got before. But I think if you look at some of the other media partners, in particular the New York Times, a very different sort of story emerges. And there in the American case, there's only a tiny fraction of what WikiLeaks released that had any currency whatsoever in the pages of the New York Times, it would be like 10% of what the Guardian did, or 20%. It would be a small fraction, which actually made it into the American press, and then was not received by their fellow newspapers in the States in any degree at all. You went to Chicago, where I come from, or San Francisco or LA, you never saw any of it. It was a complete silence, quite extraordinary. And I should say in that same context that only one television program dealt in any depth in Britain with the Iraq war logs, which is one I was associated with, and on Channel 4 and Dispatches. We did a whole program about that, but nobody else did, which was in itself extraordinary. There's not a single television program in Britain that's handled any aspect of the current Cablegate, not one aspect of it. We don't hear anything at all. In the United States, total silence. And that tells you a great deal about how journalists react to this quality of material and the fear that it provokes in them.
You touched on the New York Times, and the Times' coverage, which, as you said, was minimal compared to The Guardian and some of the other outlets, Der Spiegel, was accompanied by that John Burns piece that was very critical and looked at Assange's leadership style and what have you. And there's been a lot of reporting that's been critical of the organization, and it seems to me, in some people's view, a disproportionate amount focusing on the organization in a critical way. And Glenn Greenwald, an American blogger, who understands the story, I think, fairly well, said it's interesting because when Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, Nixon had to send the plumbers out to break into his psychiatrist's office to try to get the files on him. And Greenwald's point was, in 2010 or 2011, Obama doesn't have to do that because the other mainstream media will go out and ask Assange questions about Sweden, extradition, and what have you. There was this huge hullabaloo over the Afghan war logs about harm minimization, Gates saying that Assange would have blood on his hands. And then 2 months later, he went in front of a congressional committee and asked what became of this, and not a single casualty was recorded. So, I mean, I'm just wondering, David, because you brought up the harm minimization thing, which I think any journalist would see as a real concern, but was that not slightly overblown when, after the fact, we found out that the U.S. military, of all people, who was accusing somebody of putting Afghans in danger, didn't have a single example to offer that their warnings came true?
Yeah, well, hold on. I mean, firstly, let's just first say that we don't know that there will not be such an example. Now, of course, I'm aware of the kind of, of the weakness in one sense of that argument, but nevertheless, you have to bear in mind that this thing's not played out. Likewise, there are plenty of diplomatic situations around the world where the implications of having this stuff put out, we don't know.
Talking about Cablegate now.
I'm talking. I absolutely refuse to use the term Cablegate. What a ridiculous appellation! Absolutely absurd. I mean, if anybody is the burglar in Cablegate, then it's Bradley Manning. So, do we really want to go there? No. It's kind of part of the problem. So I don't. The problem is, there you have, if you like, you have the campaigner. You have the journalist, the medium, and then you have the question of what it is the citizen might hope for or not hope for. And one of the things that's always interesting about that is that campaigners always project themselves totally to an identification with what they imagine the citizen wants. Okay. But as The Guardian raised in an editorial at the same time as it was publishing a lot of the cables, we do recognise that governments in democratic countries and other countries should keep some things secret. They should. We don't want our information being given to our enemies, whether it's publicly via the pages of the newspapers or secretly by somebody who spies on an organisation to do it. We don't want lists of things that we're worried about being given to people who might subject them to possible terrorist attack. We don't want that to happen. As citizens, we can conceive of that. So part of the questions we have to begin to ask ourselves is, who decides that? And how do you decide that? Now, for somebody who says, however much information gets out there, it's good, it's all good. If they've kept anything from the enemy, they've also kept it from us, and they're all liars, and they're all lying, and it should all get out there. That's infantile. It's an infantile point of view. It's not the way anybody actually lives their lives, and it's not the way the governments can actually operate, and yet that is a contention. So funnily enough, and bizarrely enough, I completely agree with the Guardian's and the newspapers' need to mediate this kind of material. But you have to understand, they mediate it in the way that they want to.
Well, that's what all newspapers do.
Yeah, of course they all do.
Nobody disagrees.
So part of the
that.
question is, how do you test that proposition? Well, one established way of testing that proposition in a society ruled by law is through the law courts. But as soon as anybody talks about taking anybody to court, look at him. is absolutely jumping up and down as if his living didn't actually depend upon people taking other people.
Or yours by supporting the war.
Mine doesn't. My career was actually made more difficult by supporting the war, and Ian will probably bear me out on that.
The other thing,
and irrelevant, by the way.
I mean, I think just in response to one thing that you say, David, it is clear, and for the record, Assange did actually get in touch both with the United States government and the Denotice Committee, and the same test that is applied by the Denotice Committee, which is danger to human life or imperiling ongoing operations, were put to them, and anything that they wanted to come back with was taken into account. So, to say it was not dealt with, it's just wrong.
Also, I can give you a personal experience. When Cablegate, sorry, you don't like that, whatever the phrase is you like.
just call it Gate.
Gate, whatever it is. When it actually emerged, I got a telephone call from a woman in Boston who represented some aid organization, and she said, it's come to my attention that there are the names in Gate of 4 children, and would I remove them immediately? So I got the names of these children. They were all Iraqi names. And I rang up immediately WikiLeaks and said, there's 4 names here, that kids that might be at risk, and they were removed in 2 seconds, right, from this list. I then rang the woman back and said, how did you know to ring me for a start, because I'm not even in WikiLeaks? And also, who told you to ring? And she said, well, the State Department, of course. And 1 day later, the State Department denied making any overtures to WikiLeaks whatsoever to redact any of these names. I was very happy to do it immediately, and it was done immediately. But it was an example of the weird fog that seems to, of untruths that seem to float perilously over any disclosure of documents. I say that only as an example of how fast WikiLeaks was prepared to respond to it.
I also wonder if some of the mainstream media reporting on WikiLeaks has, obviously there's a little bit of envy there, perhaps jealousy from organizations that aren't now part of this, this troop that's been reported.
Sure, we hate it.
Yeah, there's some of that.
You've got wiki envy. Go on, admit it.
No, I think that must be right.
But I also wonder whether some of the reporting on the personality involved, and Assange is obviously a bit of an odd character, and so there's some stuff there that people can look at. The sort of shadowy world that lives on the web, whether some of that isn't necessarily ill-intentioned material from other media, or just media doing what they do, which is focusing on personalities, whether that's Britney Spears or Julian Assange. Is there anything to that, do you think? Just the simplification of a story rather than looking at what the documents themselves actually say. Is that fair, do you think, Ian?
I'd really like to talk about that. I've been doing my best to restrain the urge to take issue with David's characterisation of the Guardian's treatment of Assange as a betrayal, and I just have to deal with that before I talk about this.
By all means.
I just don't recognise that in any way, shape or form, and I've read the same piece that you're quoting from. We had a tricky meeting, and Mark is a witness sitting over there. The material had found its way into the hands of a second source. It was out of Julian's control. There was the prospect of that material imminently finding its way into the public domain, and we were raising the possibility that we had to go quicker with the material. Can
I just interrupt? Just provide a little background. There was an agreement made between WikiLeaks and the Guardian with this batch of material, which was Gate? Or was it the...
We're talking about cables.
Yeah. Okay.
It's the Gate I object to, so why are you all saying it twice?
Well, just to piss you off.
Oh, I see. Good. Great.
Just so you don't censor us here. So there was an agreement initially made. WikiLeaks obtained a letter from the Guardian where the Guardian said that it would not release these documents until WikiLeaks was okay with it. I'm not sure if there was a date involved. And then the Guardian obtained the same material from a second source, said it was going to go forward, and that's where the conflict sort of erupted.
So we said, and then this is all documented in the Vanity Fair piece, that since Julian Assange no longer had complete control of this material, it was now, we knew, in the possession of someone else. Actually, we knew of at least one other person. It could emerge at any point somewhere else. We had to consider going quicker. We had a long discussion about it. We ended up reaching an agreement where we went about a month later. I just don't recognise. I don't know how you characterise that as a betrayal by any stretch of the imagination.
Do you not?
No, I don't. And I don't think. I mean, Mark, would you characterise it as a betrayal?
You don't recognise it, that when you make an agreement with somebody, that you are going to take their material and there's a condition that they attach to it, and you don't like the condition, and then something comes along that gives you an excuse to break it, and you break it, you think that's not a betrayal. And you think, you think that other people sitting around the world thinking about whether they should next deal with you in the same way again won't look at that and think, that was a little bit dodgy, and won't think that your invocation of the second source, etc., is actually not sufficient excuse. I mean, this is one of the reasons why people find journalists tricky, is because we operate to that logic.
Well, or is this the culture clash because they have competitive reasons to think about that WikiLeaks doesn't?
Fine, and let's say that then. In that case, everybody can see where we are.
Hang on a minute.
You don't want somebody else sticking it out before you.
We ran this material by complete agreement with Julian and WikiLeaks and 4 other media organisations. I mean, Mark,
defend me.
No. I mean, was it a betrayal? Are you paying? Would you characterise this by another individual obtained the material. It could have gone anywhere.
From?
Well, I'm not going to name. Well, actually,
no, it didn't exist in any other place, did it?
Privileged knowledge
because
about
if it existed in any other place, then in that case, the conditions that Gavin said don't exist, because it wasn't kept safe, was it? If they got it from somewhere else, so it came from the same place. It was somebody else in the same organisation going behind the back of the guy you had made the agreement with. That's what it was. We all know it.
I'm not going to get into what the sourcing of the second source was. The fact is, there was another version of this data around, and that raised the possibility that that data could go anywhere. We didn't have a lock on that data at all. It could go anywhere. Any other publication could have published it, and it was completely natural. Any news organisation in the world would have said, we need to think about going quicker, and that's what we did. And we had a long conversation, and we ended up reaching an arrangement whereby we went a month later. Everyone was happy. We were all signed up to it. It wasn't a betrayal by any stretch of the imagination. Can I move on to the second subject about the personalisation of the subject? I think Julian is an extremely colourful character. He is very aware of that. He uses that very smartly. He's very aware that he can. A picture of him will play well on the front page of a newspaper. You've seen him sitting on fences outside Vaughan's house on the front page of David's picture, in Vaughan's old tweeds, I think, actually. And I think we oughtn't to be too sniffy about that. I think people who recognise the power that they have as a personality and an individual and use that need to sort of accept the rough and smooth that goes with that. They're going to be covered as an individual.
Okay, but I remember, I'm old enough to remember Watergate. It was amazing journalism, but I can't remember a whole lot of column inches being devoted to Ben Bradley's personal life when some very important journalism was taking place.
Ben Bradley was nothing like as interesting as Julian Assange.
And Ben Bradley wasn't facing sex charges in Sweden.
Yeah.
I mean,
Julian Assange is an absolute phenomenon of the modern era. Ben Bradley was, with great respect to him, was a continuity with the era that was passing. Assange represents, in a kind of very real, in a kind of dramatic way, what we think of as the uncertain coming world. And he personifies it. And he personifies it in his itinerant lifestyle, he personifies it in his style, he personifies it in his arrogance, he personifies it in his aloofness, which also, incidentally, is one of the embodiments of what we generally call cool. He is a fascinating character. It was never not going to be interesting. It was never not going to be interesting. If you're going to spend half an hour with Julian Assange talking about how the Australians bugged up the Chinese embassy, etc., that is cool stuff. That's cool shit to be standing there. And when you then add a sex story on top of that, what do you expect? A Swedish sex story, for God's sake.
I mean, I think one of the things that's quite interesting about this is that, you know, the title of this debate was WikiLeaks holding a mirror to journalism, and I think it is actually doing that. Mm-hmm. I think what is interesting is that for years we know that how we work with sources, how we treat sources, is a matter which has gone on in this kind of misty world around the edges of what the public see. The public see a very crisp image on their iPad or on in their printed paper, and they get quite a lot of good, digested information there. But what they don't see is how we get that information, or how journalists get that information. And I see it as a lawyer when I come to defend journalists. And it's quite an interesting process. And that's why I think journalists lose so often in Edie's court, because they just don't like the way they get their material. And that, I think, is what WikiLeaks is projecting. They don't like WikiLeaks because they don't like the way in which he's got his material, and they don't like journalism because they don't like the way in which they behave when they get their material. And I think that's a really interesting area for concern today, because we are now going to have to publicly defend the way in which journalists and journalistic ethics work.
Gavin, what do you think? What do you say to that? The idea that WikiLeaks, some of the hostile coverage that WikiLeaks may have attracted from mainstream media outlets, comes because their work reflects badly on the way that some mainstream media outlets have been performing.
I think that's true. I think there's no doubt of that. I think it's also true that a lot of media respond to the world's greatest power, saying to them, you mustn't print this material. They respond to it in a rather fearful way. And I think we've seen that, in how the New York Times has actually not published a great deal of the stuff that The Guardian did publish, and published well. And I thought that's disgraceful. It's also disgraceful in my terms.
The word torture not used.
The torture word never used. Civilian casualties barely used. The fact that there were thousands of civilian casualties. And one of the things that we were involved in with The Guardian was the documentation of the killing of innocents at road checkpoints. There were more people killed in those checkpoints, according to those documents, the military documents, than happened in 2 My Lies.
Wow.
That's truthful. New York Times didn't publish that. They didn't publish anything about that. And I thought that was disgraceful. Also, that after Abu Ghraib came about, and Cy Hirsch wrote what he did in the New Yorker, it continued for 18 months. Nobody said anything. In this country, they did. The Guardian did, and Channel 4 did. But nobody in the United States did. And that, to me, is a serious comment on how serious work is treated. On the other hand, however, the New York Times was very happy to run a very large piece attacking Julian Assange as a person. So I wasn't in any way surprised by that kind of balancing act, because they were terribly worried. They wanted to be able to say to their friends in government that, well, listen, we attacked them on Thursday, so it's all right that we ran something on Monday. That seems to be the logic of it.
The New York Times isn't here to defend itself, so I can't say whether that's true or not. But I think something that we ought to be aware of in this sort of fabulous attack on journalism, and there are significant problems as ever with journalism.
Wait a second. It's not necessarily a fabulous attack on journalism. It's somebody dumping 250,000 documents or whatever, released and then reflecting badly simply because a lot of this work has been omitted.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realise that this had the status of objective truth rather than subjective opinion. I'll reformulate. Let me try and deal with the objective truth that you're saying, that journalism was totally inadequate, and then try and give my subjective view on that. My subjective view on that, which is that a significant proportion of the stuff which came out through WikiLeaks in all of the documents had already been reported. A very significant amount of it had actually
there's nothing new here argument. Let's have the crowd
hold on. If I want to say the phrase "there's nothing new here," I will use the phrase "there's nothing new here." What I said is a significant proportion of it, because this goes to the point of whether or not journalism had or hadn't been doing its job. In a large number of these stories, I mean, for instance, when we saw a lot of the cables, what people were saying, insofar as they could deal with the sheer amount of it, and insofar as they were dealing with places they knew about, other than places they knew nothing about, and that nobody's seen a cable from for 1,000 years, and everybody would be happy if they never did for another 1,000 years, and so on, was, yes, this was the stuff we knew. I mean, to say that the American embassy thinks this about Cameron was to recognise what I myself had told the American ambassador at a meeting.
But not all of us were at those kind of meetings with that kind of access.
I also said it in my column.
We didn't get the cable of you and the American ambassador. That's a hell of a
For some reason, he just wouldn't go. He was too. But actually, that's part of the Zionist plot to keep Israel out of the.
Okay, but I've deflected you from the point that you were wanting to make on the back of what Gavin said.
The point I was wanting to make is that actually a significant amount of this had appeared in journalistic, about the casualties, about and so on. Now, not in that kind of detail. So a lot of it was absolutely fascinating, corroborative evidence to contentions which had been in the media, and stories which had been there. So I'm not going to diminish.
And often denied.
The scare of it. Sometimes denied, and that is kind of value, but nevertheless reported, because that's the issue we're talking about here.
I think a lot of people understood that there were issues of corruption with the Afghan government. There were even smaller issues of corruption with the Iraqi government. But when the U.S. Embassy cable suggests $52 million is being taken out in briefcases, that's a rather powerful argument. That gives evidence and weight to what was a suspicion before. We don't have those suspicions without some sense that there's something wrong.
True.
What happened with so many of these cables was precisely they gave documentation, a serious, informed opinion about what was actually happening that was also wonderfully sacrosanct because it's not libelous. And so it had the wonderful quality these cables are doing.
There's no privilege associated with the cables.
Well, there is a bit of privilege because you can. It's under the Reynolds defense. There's a bit.
But isn't the other aspect of this that is very important on cable that it eliminates plausible deniability on the part of governments everywhere? Because you can report, as you do every once in a while, what you hear from an ambassador, or you put it in your column or what have you, and then someone will go on high and try to go seconds on that story, and somebody will deny it. But when it's in the cables and it's in those documents, all of a sudden the whole notion of plausible deniability on the part of the powers is eradicated. And so even if you say there's nothing new here or there's not much new here, what's new is it's in their handwriting.
Look, can we just try and get it back to where we were? We were with whether or not there was doing a job here that conventional journalism had shirked. And my contention was, because a lot of these stories have been reported, that it's not true. That it is not true. That is not to say that it doesn't give you significant additional information which goes to the heart of those stories. But what is interesting, by and large, is that all the cables and so on confirmed the stories which were already out there rather than turn them on their heads. That's actually surely interesting. Now, speaking as somebody who's very interested in conspiracy theories, one of the things that I found incredibly amusing about it was that conspiracy theories got nothing out of cable, out of the cable dump and so on. Absolutely nothing out of it. It didn't suggest that there was some kind of strange military, industrial, corporate, which is funny because actually, of course, that's the one thing that Julian always says there is.
Yeah. Just back on the personalization thing. There will be some questions. Just give us a couple more minutes here. Very quickly on temper. The personalization, Assange as the figure that you described, do you not think it would be in the interests of WikiLeaks as an organization to maybe create something like, I don't know, an advisory board, some other people whose reputations might be seen, well regarded, to kind of depersonalize in a structural sense this organization and take it away from Assange's own identity? Do you think there's any value in that idea?
Well, I mean, you know as well as I do that Daniel Domscheit-Berg, his former collaborator, has split off with a very similar thought. He feels that WikiLeaks was an organisation that became too tightly focused around Julian, that it was the Julian Assange show, and that you needed to produce an organisation that was more transparently run with more sort of traditional organisational governance. I'm loath to criticise Julian for that, because I think Julian has been has used his profile very cleverly. And what Julian is doing is trying to make himself, I think, the brand, if you like, that is synonymous with whistleblowing. He wants you to think, if you're a pissed off analyst in GCHQ or wherever it is, and you've got something you want to share with the world, I'll send it to that Assange fella, not the Guardian, which poses a really interesting question for the traditional media partners like us, which is, have we helped to create, as it were, a brand which people will go to in place of traditional media? I personally feel very strongly that people won't, actually. I think the thing that's been missing from the discussion about earlier, the discussion about the numbers of documents and so on that WikiLeaks gets, is that I think most whistleblowers actually want a relationship with the media outlet that they are going to. They want to colour the way the material is treated, or at least they want to try to colour the way the material is treated. They want a relationship of trust with the person who's going to control the way that it's revealed.
And they look at the organization as an organization that may suit their ideological,
yeah, exactly.
as
They're
a
going to
fit.
choose it. They'll choose it because they have a feel for the place.
Just before we go, just before you do, I'd like to just come back on
that's
2
fine.
points.
I just want to say one thing to the people holding this. Millicent, the mic. Let's put some hands up. People who have questions. Millicent, if you can get the hands, the mic into someone's hands there. And we'll just have Mark answer this point.
I just wanted to pick up, because, David, you say that there's not much that's changed. I think that there has been a significant change, and I think it's reflective of what journalists get. They're not getting, a couple of dog-eared photocopies as from the source now. They are getting, CDs and DVDs full of material which now needs analysis. It needs people with different types of skills. The old writing skills are taking or need to be supplemented with additional skills. So I think that's one thing. And I think also in relation to the sort of brand Assange point which Ian makes, I'm not sure that I identify with that, because you have to remember that Julian was anonymous for many, many years, and the purpose of him being anonymous was to assist with the development of the organisation, and he would have remained anonymous had he not been outed. And now he is outed. All the other people, or a lot of the other people who are associated with the organisation, don't particularly want the same sort of profile. And so I think that he takes that, and he understands that there's a benefit that goes with that, and there's a burden that goes with that. And I think that it's not about that particular situation. I don't see him as being particularly adept. I see him as being, if you like, the sole public representative of this phenomenon, and as a result of that, he's the only person that people can get a picture of. And I think the Americans made the fundamental mistake of saying he was WikiLeaks, which he wasn't.
I mean, it seems there's a confluence of two factors. One, I chaired a meeting, Channel 4 released its film. 650 journalists turned up. Of them, only 3 asked questions. All the rest were rushing forward to take pictures and shouting at Julian, and nobody else in the room made any difference at all. It was quite astonishing. No matter what we said from the podium to Megan, it was lost completely. And similarly in Washington, the same thing. The sense that I asked an audience in Washington, how many of you have heard of Julian Assange? And of course, every hand of 700 journalists went up. How many people have read the documents? 3 hands went up. Right? And that's the phenomena that we can't control, that certainly Julian is not in charge of. He's not in charge of the press that are obsessed by celebrity nonsense of that kind. And I think it's true. There's a lot of that that deflects people from the issues.
We have somebody with a microphone here.
Yeah.
And the next question is coming from where? Okay, if we just get, just Millicent, you decide. I just want to make sure that we have a second question teed up. Go ahead, tell us your name and if you have an association with an organization, and if anyone you want to direct the question to.
Sure. Hi, my name's Tom Espiner. I work for a tech publication called ZDNet UK, which is part of CBS. I was just wondering. By the way, David, I disagree with you about the effect of WikiLeaks. I think that the cables have shown that there has been a significant sort of drop off between what governments are telling journalists and what's actually happening. But my question isn't actually that. My question is the UK government is tightening up its data security processes. US government has tightened up its data security processes. Has WikiLeaks, far from increasing transparency, actually decreased transparency because governments are now hunkering down?
Why don't we throw that at Gavin?
I don't think that's a responsibility of WikiLeaks. I mean, if you're calling for open transparency and the government decides to close everything down, that's not going to prevent you or any journalist from calling for transparency. I mean, it seems fairly logical. I mean, it's an unfortunate byproduct if that happens, for sure, but that's not his responsibility or anybody else's. That's what governments want to do to protect their secrets.
It's interesting. I mentioned to Ian the other day when we were talking that a member of the security services came to see me, and he said, this is actually a peculiarly American problem. Nobody else shares their cables with 3.5 million people. Because statistically, at that point, you are penetrated by just about everybody on the planet, and only the electorate doesn't know. And what he said was that statistically, that every other country limits the electronic copies that you can make to 1,000, because then you know that you're only penetrated by the Chinese and the Russians and maybe somebody else. And he said, of course, we put stuff there for them. That's, of course, part of what you'd expect us to do. And so I think one has to remember, and so in response to that, I think people are not tightening up the security, that what the Americans are doing are going back to what is the status quo ante.
We have another question.
Yeah.
We also have a show of hands for the next question, so we get the mic on the move, Millie, please. If you can just pick somebody, but go ahead.
Hello, yeah, Phil Harding, I'm a journalist. A very quick observation and a question. The observation is this. From what I saw of how you handle WikiLeaks around this time around, The Guardian in particular, but the other news organisations as well, I don't think you just tamed WikiLeaks. What I also think you did is you sharpened them up. Because this time around, unlike the Afghan cables, what you did this time was you drip-fed them so that there was a story a day or 2 stories a day. And you very carefully managed that by dripping out what was in the WikiLeaks cables at a time. And that, I think, had a much greater impact. My question is about data dump journalism, if I can call it that. Do you think news organizations are sufficiently equipped to deal with this level of industrial, almost, emails and cables that is coming through? And secondly, what effect do you think this will have on the news agenda overall? Because when WikiLeaks was there was very little else that was in The Guardian that appeared. When the Telegraph did the MP's expenses, again, very little else appeared in the Telegraph. So are news organisations equipped to deal with this? What effect is all this going to have on the news organisations if there are, as Gavin says, 10 million, 12 million emails piling up waiting to be dealt with?
Just to go to your first point first, and I'd love to take full credit for the drip feeding way we did the cables, but that was every bit Julian's thinking as much as it was ours. I mean, I think he was very committed to doing the war logs in big dumps, but absolutely saw that the problem with that was that they almost drowned themselves. You know, we had 20 or 30 great stories in each of those. I think we did about 20 pages the first day, but there's a sort of cancelling out quality. So I think we both learned our way to that. On your second point, the answer is I don't think news organisations, well, I can speak for The Guardian, I haven't been anywhere else for a while, but we're nowhere near ready to be able to deal with this kind of data, and we have had a really steep learning curve over the last 8 months. I mean, we have learnt a ton about how to, because what we got from WikiLeaks was not something which you could bring up on your screen and search. It was a set of data files which we had to then have our own developers turn into a database that we could do intelligent searches on. And what I've watched over the last 6 months is journalists really learning how to search data in ways that they hadn't done before, because most journalists who came to it at best brought the abilities that you or I have to search for things on Google. But actually what you've seen, and actually WikiLeaks have some very interesting people working with them, and we've since got some people with those sort of skills, is a whole new breed of data journalist who can search for stuff in ways that certainly I wouldn't be able to do. So I think there's a real challenge. On your point about the agenda, well, you know, look, if we get another dump the size of this, I think I'd like to deal with that problem of capsizing the agenda again. But I think these things come around once in a while, and I don't think, and the gentleman over there made the point about, you know, this was, as much as anything else, a product of a period when people were rushing to putting lots of sensitive data in big databases. And just as when you get, you know, if you look at the sort of history of aircraft design, for instance, it heads in a direction, they reduce the number of engines, and then suddenly there's a crash, and then the number of engines goes up again. And there's a sort of history of pushing things until you find a point of weakness. And I think this whole episode has revealed the weakness of great databases, with consequences that will play out way beyond the sort of journalistic ones we're talking about. I mean, imagine having the argument about the NHS spine, which we were all consumed in 2 or 3 years ago now. I don't think that argument would get off the ground, because people would say, well, look at WikiLeaks, ditto ID cards and ditto other big databases.
I interviewed Assange a few weeks, just on the same point, Gavin. I interviewed Assange a couple months ago, I guess, and talking about the way he was working with media, and he said, I'm learning about the media. And you know, this is a guy who was so critical of the media. I'm actually learning about the media. But I guess what Ian's telling us is that the media is also learning how to deal with data.
Right. I think it's true. I think it's also true that what often isn't said about WikiLeaks is that it's a replicable model. And if you think about that for a short while, then all of a sudden a lot of things become possible that aren't possible now. I mean, there could, for example, easily be professional groups, a doctor's WikiLeaks, an architect's WikiLeaks, a railway engineer's WikiLeaks, in which people who know the material could judge it and see how relevant it is. One of the problems now is it requires journalists like The Guardian to actually disseminate this material in an intelligent way, to understand what's relevant, what isn't. But that may well change. There are already 3 new WikiLeaks forming just in the last month. I'm told there are going to be 6 or 7 more just in the next short while. And I think Julian thinks that's wonderful. So I don't think.
Yeah, but David Aaronovitch put his head in his hands.
Oh, I do.
As soon as you said replicable model, he went like
No, I
that.
didn't. You misunderstand me completely. It's my fault for communicating so badly. Not only do I not think that things will change, that will stay the same, but I think they have changed irrevocably. But not just in the way that we're talking about. I mean, there are a number of things that we're kind of skirting over here, or that we're dealing with and then skirting over. First thing is, what we are creating, or we're going to create, is effectively an analyst caste. It's not just within media organisations that it will be created. The Institute for Fiscal Studies is a classic example of an early form of the analyst caste. We increasingly have huge amounts of information available to us well before WikiLeaks. There was information, for Christ's sake, on the internet before WikiLeaks came along, you know, and there was an enormous amount of it, and it's increased exponentially. And now we need to analyse it. We are aware of the need, of the increasing need to discriminate between what is put out, things that are put out there, and to analyse them. So increasingly we turn to a form of analyst caste, almost a kind of priestly caste of analysts, to tell us what the stuff we're getting means. We're bound to have to do that. Now, there is one problem with what Ian said, and I by and large agree with it, which is the question about whether or not existing media organisations actually have the economic base to be able to provide it, because it's bloody expensive. These people have got to be good, unless we're going to kind of develop those out of our free internship base, which is how some of us kind of manage ourselves these days. It's very expensive. By the way, it puts an end to what we call investigative journalism, by the way.
Well, it doesn't necessarily. But just let me flip that on you and say, media organizations are shrinking. They have fewer and fewer reporters to do anything, anywhere.
Yep.
So can the argument not be made that WikiLeaks actually comes along at a very timely moment with providing raw data that organizations can then refine?
Look, in a way, it doesn't matter whether it does or it doesn't. You see what I mean? It's not quite part of the argument is you can say WikiLeaks good or WikiLeaks bad. How about just saying WikiLeaks and something like it inevitable? More and more of it inevitable. What are the responses likely to be, whether you want to try and control them or not? And then the question comes about how you kind of deal with them. And they're not just issues for journalists. They're democratic issues. They're genuinely democratic issues. We sometimes, as I said, talk as if our interests are congruent with everybody else outside, that we have come to some kind of magic arrangement whereby the population of Great Britain or America or whatever agrees with us about the fact that we should do all these things. They don't necessarily. It's not been put to them. So there's a huge, big question about information, how you get it, whose information you get. Just today, we have Max Mosley going to court on the basis of Max Mosley trying to get the idea that people should have the right to be informed if something about them is going to be used which infringes on their privacy. And we had a big discussion about this in the Times, and somebody was thundering that he shouldn't be able to, somebody was thundering that he should be able to. And it was difficult. It's irrelevant. Because fairly soon, one of the women who he's having sex with will stick that out on the internet and the whole thing will be out. And your medical records will be out, whether they're on paper or they're not on paper.
I agree with that.
Where's the mic lit now?
Over here.
Mic there. Oh, this one here, and we're going to go there. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Chris King. I'm a member.
Sorry,
of
we're going to wait for the mic. Now say it again.
I'm a member. My name's Chris King. I'm a member of the club. There have been some articles in The Guardian and other places recently saying that the American media has been backing off any suggestion that Assange should be protected because he's not a journalist. That disagrees with what a lot of people in Europe have been saying about it's important for free speech. So I'd like to ask you, is Assange a journalist? Is WikiLeaks a journalistic organisation? And if not, what is it?
Can I ask why it matters?
Is the mic off? The mic is off. Is that it? The question is that the contention has been made, particularly in U.S. media, that Assange is not subject to the protections that journalists enjoy legally because he's not a journalist. Mark's point is, why does it matter?
I think it matters because it seems to be used as an argument as to whether he should be banged up in prison for the rest of his life or not. If he's a journalist, no. If he's not, then yes, he's fair game.
But there's a reason why this argument is raised, and one of the rather unpleasant ends of that argument is that if he's not a journalist, then he's not protected under normal press conditions and under press laws and the shield laws and all the rest of it. He becomes immensely vulnerable. And one of the reasons why I don't care, I think, as Mark doesn't, whether he's a journalist or not, he performs a meaningful and powerful role in that community. Which I don't think anybody could deny, and therefore he is certainly a journalist by that definition, if nothing else.
I think he is a journalist within the broadest definition and perhaps even the narrowest definition. He's certainly a publisher. He certainly goes through and works with the material, and therefore there is part of the publishing function in there and certainly part of the journalistic function. But the only reason it matters, I think, in any way, shape or form, is that the Americans give peculiar protections to journalists. In Europe, we're far more civilized, and we give those protections to people who give information to the public, irrespective of what their nomenclature is.
Ian, what do you make of that argument that we sometimes hear, I suppose more in the American context than in Europe, is that, well, if Julian Assange is a terrorist, what does that make the New York Times? What does that make the organizations that are working hand in glove with him? I mean, do you give that a second thought?
Well, that's exactly why. That's exactly why this is really important. It is important because, and for what it's worth, I think the answer is that, among other things, yes, he is a journalist. He also sometimes prefers to be characterised as a source, and sometimes he prefers to be characterised as a campaigner. He is a number of things, but I think it's entirely legitimate for him to claim that, as you say, the functions he fulfills are journalistic, and it's hugely important because. If it ever came to a prosecution in America, the question to the U.S. authorities would be, if he's a journalist, why are you treating him differently to the New York Times, since you show no inclination to indict them or indeed us? So I think that question goes to the heart of it, and I think the answer is...
And I think we also have to remember that there has been this long tradition and history of civil servants leaking classified information to traditional journalists for years and years, so we just have a slightly different environment.
Anyone else on that before we go back to the floor? I think we're going to go to the back corner now, are we?
Peter Wilson from the Australian newspaper. I was just wondering, Mark, if you are the lawyer that Vanity Fair tells us help Julian to threaten The Guardian with legal action to punish it if it went ahead and published a leak of WikiLeaks information. And if that is true, is that not hilariously hypocritical?
Why don't we just say, is it not hypocritical?
Why is it thought to be hypocritical?
Because I thought WikiLeaks supported the free flow of information and leaks, and isn't that the whole raison d'etre of what you're doing?
Well, I'm not WikiLeaks. I mean, that's the first thing. But I infer that I am the person who is referred to in that article, but I think it's a fairly inaccurate article. So I'm not sure that... I mean, nobody came to talk to me or to anybody at WikiLeaks, as far as I'm aware, about that article. So it wasn't an event that I actually recognised. And as far as I know, I've never threatened to sue Ian ever.
Come and take the fifth.
And
As far as I know.
yet, there may be somewhere in the history, and it may be yet to come. Who knows? But at the moment, I can't for the life of me think of a situation. And I recall at the end of that evening, Ian and I sitting down and downing some very expensive red wine.
It was cheap, actually, but.
Just say something about my palate.
Did anyone else on the panel detect the irony in the leaker threatening to sue over a leak? I mean, that one, even like North Americans aren't supposed to get irony, but I even got that.
I don't think that was the point. I mean, I think that the question is, if you've got two sources and you've made promises to both sources, are you required to honour both of those promises, which is the position that Alan Rusbridger took, that he was obliged to do so without any threat, as I understand it, or is it in a situation where you can discard someone, which is I think.
But there was also the case where the Guardian was publishing information leaked from the Swedish prosecution, and there was unhappiness from, I understand, Assange, possibly even his lawyer, on that. And again, the leaker threatening to sue.
Even
over
then,
a
I
leak.
don't think I threatened Ian.
Okay, you can quibble with the language. They weren't thrilled with it, and they seem to oppose the idea of a leak, which some would find ironic, some would ramp all the way up to hypocritical. I don't know. David,
I think there's a substantive difference between what WikiLeaks puts out there, which is never about anyone's sex life. It's about corruption.
Yes,
it's about
it's not. Yes, it is.
There's almost nothing. Yeah.
No.
Well, they said she was voluptuous. No one said anything about sex.
Voluptuous nurses.
Yeah. To be fair.
Give us a break.
Okay.
Anyway, we have a question here. And where's the next question coming from, Millie? From back there. Go ahead. Tell us who you are, please.
John Sweeney from BBC Panorama. If Julian's listening, we'd still very much want to interview you. You chaps have been great, but you're not Julian. And we'd still extend our interview in the spirit of openness. We want to interview Julian Assange. There's one thing I'm worried about. I've heard a rumour that he thinks I'm an operating level 3 Scientologist. That's not true. There are.
Have a quick shout with them over there.
Yeah, I'll have a quick chat. So anyway, so here's the question, and the question is to Ian Katz. That in doing the story from the Swedish prosecutor, and as a journalist I can see that it's a story, why didn't you leave it to somebody like the Daily Mail? But didn't you, in truth, stab your source in the back?
Well, I touched in the opening in the difficulty that you have when someone you're collaborating with becomes the story, and it is difficult. And the fact is that that material came to The Guardian. So what you're saying is that once that material had come to The Guardian, we shouldn't have published it. Yeah. And I personally think that the credibility of The Guardian's coverage of the entire cable affair, the WikiLeaks story, the Assange story, would have been completely shot if any of our readers knew that that material had come to us and we had sat on it out of some idea of loyalty to someone we were collaborating with. So I think all of the credibility of the 700 odd cable stories we wrote, I think would have been undone if we had sat on that story. In the event, all we could do with it was to do our level best to give Julian a fair shake in responding to it. And let's not get into the kind of interstices of that, but it was a difficult time. We did our best. Some people were unhappy. I think we were fair.
Can I just say very quickly, I completely agree with what Ian has said there. My idea of betrayal had nothing to do with the publication of those pieces, which were absolutely journalistically proper, and it would have opened you up, exactly as you say, to an idea of partiality towards somebody purely because they've done you a turn.
I got to be wondering, David, though, you're sitting at the Times and having this drip, you're watching your competition. You hate it. It's water torture for the Times, day after day for 2 weeks, and then The Guardian comes out and gets the break on the prosecution in Sweden. What are you thinking at that stage?
Well, I don't recall us feeling that was a problem. The Assange Swedish. I mean, it was nothing.
You got the denunciation the next day, didn't you?
Yeah. Who was that by him?
You got Julian denouncing.
Yeah, we got the scoop of Julian denouncing.
Yeah, we're good.
That's right. So we were happy twice over.
We have a question, I believe, from the back corner. Yes, can you stand up, please, so we can see you?
I'd forgotten that.
Is this on? Anthony Barnett from Open Democracy. I wonder if I can. I think we're getting distracted off what is the central issue about WikiLeaks and its importance and its political and, if you like, its democratic importance. And I just want to try and address the point, particularly to David Aaronovitch, where you're saying, it seems to me it's a good point, that we shouldn't just assume that we know what citizens want, and we should just, that your average or regular citizen will identify with the government's need for secrecy.
Please don't repeat his point. Please come to the question, because there are many people who have questions.
The thing is that I think if you link the WikiLeaks, as another questioner did, to the Telegraph leaks of the parliamentary expenses, which was also a dump, what that showed was that we have people that would like to be able to trust the powers that be, but are discovering that they behave in ways that we don't expect, that we can't trust them. And that exposure is an essential part of any kind of, there will be rough and smooth with it, but that was absolutely a justifiable thing. If you say to people in this country, should the Telegraph not have published
We need
it?
the question here,
Well,
please.
then, no, I'm sorry, this is a discussion. This is a really important issue. We have been, which the panel is telling us what we should think about what the people think, and I'm just trying to respond on this, and then you can say if there's nothing to say on it, that's fine. And I think if you just take one of the WikiLeaks stories, because I actually think because of the sheer number, it's quite difficult to focus, or two of them, on what have been important. If you were a Nigerian and you had suspected, or there had been journalists who had said that Shell Oil was corrupting your government, and then you see a leak from the US Embassy which is reporting this fact at every level of your government, this is something you would want to know. I think that is extremely valuable. And what will then happen to that information, that is going to take time to work out. Similarly, in terms of conspiracy, and broadly I agree with David Wondrich, I mean that there's a lot of conspiracy theories are insane, but we did have a suspicion that members of our royal family supported corruption and were against investigations of corruption, and now we know this is their culture, and I think that will then change, hopefully, their behaviour. So this and I think it's really important that there is a public service aspect to the sheer exposure of what the authorities are doing if they are behaving reprehensibly, and if they aren't, well, that's fine.
Supposing they aren't behaving reprehensibly, but they are behaving secretly. No. They don't necessarily have to behave reprehensibly 100% of the time. Let's say that they behave reprehensibly 50% of the time, and the other 50% of the time they don't behave reprehensibly, and within that other 50% there are things that they want to keep secret. What do we say about that?
They should remain secret.
So we say they should be secret. Now, one of the questions, the entire the great big caboodle of transparency, of privacy, and so on. To me, this is all, people try to separate them off. They think they can. Actually, I don't really think that's possible. That we are constructing a culture in which everything is to be open about just about everybody most of the time. You talk about, Anthony, you were talking about the powers that be. To a lot of people, you are a power that bees. I am a power that bees. Certainly, the Frontline Club is owned by a power that bees. Julian Assange is, in one sense, a very, very powerful person, and people will want to know about it. If you like, the kind of almost ineluctable trends, it seems to me, to what this kind of openness does, particularly in some societies, and one of the things we've got to deal with is the difference between one type of society and another. We are now going to have societies which are almost entirely open, and some societies which remain almost entirely closed, and that's a really interesting phenomenon that we have to deal with. We talk about journalistic organisations as if they only exist really in, let's say, Germany, Britain and America, and maybe to France. I'm not quite sure why France wasn't on the list of maybe Assange they thought was a French name. I don't know.
No, Le Figaro was involved, wasn't it?
Was it?
Le Monde.
Yeah, but just on your point of what if it's half reprehensible and half secret, well, isn't it up to news organizations to then decide the way they always do what is reprehensible and therefore what is news and what is just secret and what isn't? Isn't that it?
No, but that's what's changed with WikiLeaks after all. I mean, the thing about WikiLeaks is that all that information came out. Now, let's find out a question in principle. Do people in principle believe that all the information that came out should be available to everybody? Yes or no? Or should it be up to Ian Katz and a cast of analysts in The Guardian to decide what it is that you actually see, not what's important? They're already going to do that. They're going to sift it and say this is what we analyse it as being. Are they going to decide what you see? Well, not according to Julian Assange version 1. Julian Assange version 1 said, I don't want to be mediated by what the newspapers and other people do. I want it out there for citizens to get. Is that the way we're going? Is that what Domscheit-Berg and so on are going to do? Are we going to have whistleblowing that gets straight out there onto the internet? Because this is quite often what I imagine what some whistleblowers will want to do.
But isn't
which is it?
But isn't Julian Assange's model number 1 was flawed? He saw it was inherently flawed. That's why he got involved with journalists who then sift and do that with every other story they ever work with. So what I guess what Assange was saying is that your fear about everything being out there kind of falls silent because people still trust mainstream media, rightly or wrong.
It's not a fear. It's what I think will happen.
I mean, I share your concern, David, about Dom Scheibberg and the organisation he's setting up, because I don't see that operating in mediated partnership at the moment. I don't see it being mediated, and so as a consequence, I'm concerned about that.
I think that's a misunderstanding. Getting too detailed to get into a Dom Scheibberg discussion, but he is explicitly committed to mediation by media organisations.
Well, you've gone into a partnership with him.
I haven't gone into any partnership with him at all.
Oh, I thought you had.
Have you? No, I haven't. No, we haven't.
That's a denial. We have a question. Can you stand up, please, and tell us who you are?
Hi, I'm Magda Walter. I'm a former journalist, but I also work in areas related to media still as a consultant. It seems that you've been just addressing a very key issue that I haven't really seen in this whole debate really nailed down. And it maybe is at the heart of a much broader issue between traditional journalism and new journalism that is mediated by the internet. And that is the issue of interrogating the source. You just said a moment ago, Ian, that if somebody's pissed off, so your traditional whistleblower who generally has an agenda and brings something to a traditional media organizations, we have the craft, the traditional media, to interrogate the source's agenda and therefore determine whether the source is a reliable one or not. The people who are in favor of dumping don't have that skill set. So I would like to know who the advocates of dumping everything, how would they defend the fact that we still, old journalists, have the skills to interrogate the source and determine whether the source is really credible or not, or has an agenda and therefore can be trusted?
I mean, it would seem to me that, first of all, there isn't any real dumping. What you've seen of Gategate is only 3% of all the material. There's 250,000 documents still to come. No, but that's what you're suggesting leads to the feeling that there's an enormous pile of documents sort of dumped in a public square, and journalists run all over them trying to find stories. I don't think that's the case. It certainly wasn't the case in the Iraq war logs. It wasn't the case in the Afghan war logs, for that matter, either. And it certainly isn't the case here. I think there's always mistakes when you're dealing with small organizations and vast amounts of material, and I'm sure mistakes have been made. But on the whole, the implication is, and certainly the intention is, that WikiLeaks, for example, would give them to serious journalist organizations to refine that stuff and to analyze it for the public. That's why they went there in the first place. They can't do that. Well, they can't do it with the ease with which The Guardian, or even one would hope the New York Times, could do it.
Now, I thought actually The Guardian went to the WikiLeaks. Right. That was my understanding of how that operation actually worked in the first place. In other words, The Guardian was the midwife to that process. It's not true, incidentally, or it wasn't true a few months ago, that stuff isn't dumped on the WikiLeaks site. It most certainly is, and you can find the most extraordinary and rather kind of rococo array of stuff around. Otherwise, I say I've written about this, but one of the ones that took me most by surprise was the decision that somebody had to dump on there every information about the guy who started something called Punternet, because they obviously didn't like him, and that went to and included the Google Street View of the man's house, which was also put on the WikiLeaks site. That certainly is unmediated, but it certainly shows an agenda and an intention. And by the way, this is a very double-edged thing. When somebody wanted to give inside information and to do a leak which was inimical, that they thought were inimical to the previous government's policy on immigration, they didn't come to The Guardian or to The Times. They went to a right-wing newspaper in order to get that, and got the story that they wanted as a result of it. So we absolutely can't pretend that this is a value-free process that we somehow take people's intention out of, and that becomes very important. And I'll give you just an example from today of how difficult this becomes. When I went onto the website of the Frontline Club this morning in order to see what time this started, sorry, I know you told me, but there we go. What should I see but a running strapline of stories going across the top? The one that catches my eye is an article about Julian Assange by a man called Israel Shamir. Israel Shamir is a notorious Swedish anti-Semite and Holocaust denier.
Russian.
He is, yeah, and he is one of, one of the kind of, the sort of people that if you found him sitting amongst you and you knew what he was, you'd all kind of move to the edges of the room so that you weren't anywhere close to him. It struck me that whoever had lodged that there simply couldn't know who it was and whose theories there were that were kind of going on there. And it is the question of the discriminating world that should worry us more than anything else, and that we should kind of address. Not because I think you can set it back, you can push it back, but because that kind of literacy about how to read what's in front of you is going to become the dominant theme of the next, I think, 20, 30, 40 years.
What's been very interesting here is this shift from a journalist who says, I've got a source. We all know that sources who come to you are motivated by some reason or another. We hope that you as journalists expose that to us so that we understand what the motivation is. But, and sometimes it may not matter, but at least if it does affect the story, we should know about it. Where we've come to, and as you've said, it's not going away, is this situation with WikiLeaks and similar organisations, that information isn't going to be examined in the same way, nor will anyone know. They cannot know what the motivation is. You may be able to infer it from the Google Street View or some other place, but that is part of the new era of the electronic media. And I think as a result, we as societies, as we start to move away from mass media, are going to have to become more discriminating about what it is we're reading. So we give much more credence to things which have been mediated and by a news organisation than we do to stuff which is just posted somewhere. It's like reading a blog. You give less credence to it.
It's funny how in some ways WikiLeaks, which set out to sort of fill in the gaps of mainstream media or to make up for the shortcomings, has in many ways reminded people of what's good about mainstream media, because WikiLeaks never considers the source unless it jumps into bed with mainstream media, and then mainstream media considers the source for it.
Can I just come back very quickly on the source point? My instinct is that actually we're not careering into a world where all sources are going to dump their stuff personally on the WikiLeaks or the next WikiLeaks, but that, as I said before, I think they are going to want to sustain this relationship with journalists. But let's say I'm wrong, I think, or even partly wrong. There will doubtless be lots more examples where traditional media organisations like us get large amounts of data that are divorced from the source in the way that we have been with this. And what's really interesting is that all that does is it creates a new level of reporting that's required, because instead of interrogating the source, you interrogate the data. And one of the things I've been really struck by is because we've had this material for 5 or 6 months now and have really spent a lot of hours looking at it, there's an awful lot of stories that we thought we saw that we since dispensed with, because actually when you kick the tires you found out they weren't quite the story they seemed to be. And some of those stories we're now seeing popping up because as the data finds itself into more and more hands. Here's one example of one of the newspapers that's recently got the data that's run a apparently dramatic spy story in Europe. Well, the German colleagues that we had, the Spiegel colleagues, had exactly that story, but they did the next round of reporting, knocked it down. And I thought it was a really interesting illustration of what's required when you're dealing with data without source.
I think one of the problems, though, is, and I think why you're partly wrong, Ian, is you're looking at a very domestic sense in my judgment. And I think what actually we're looking at is if you live in a totalitarian regime, then in those circumstances something like WikiLeaks is incredibly useful to get information out, to get opposition information out. So I think there's always a space for it. The question is whether it's a news space or some other kind of space, and I think that's where we're having the debate tonight.
Got a question over here. Vaughn, we're just about out of time, unless you want to extend a little bit for more questions.
I will extend a little.
Okay. Go ahead. Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm James Leeds, and I'm no one of any real consequence. I feel that the mainstream media has wholesale failed, especially in America, to hold democratic societies to account.
Quite right.
Accountable. And whistleblowing appears to be a way, for me anyway, that has blossomed, really flowered. One of the things that's flowered and really beautiful about the internet is that whistleblowing has now become something that can happen, and it seems to be effective in holding these things accountable in a way that you guys poking around and trying to interview people just hasn't done. I'd like to know if The Guardian particularly has any plans to enable people to use similar technologies to WikiLeaks to anonymously contact people like The Guardian with this kind of information in the future. Because if I was a whistleblower in some deep government facility, I wouldn't be able to contact The Guardian today. I wouldn't be able to contact The Times in that kind of way. And it's a technological thing.
I think there's a really good point there. There are at least two things which WikiLeaks does which are of huge value. The creating of an anonymous route from the source to the media, and not to be underestimated, the cleaning, as it were, of the documents so that there are no digital or other fingerprints on it when it goes down the line. And I mean, there's a really interesting question about why we shouldn't do exactly that ourselves. I mean, at the moment, I think we probably haven't got the technology to do all that. But
you're friends with Julian; he's pretty good at that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'll ask him next time I see him. I think that's a really interesting question about whether WikiLeaks may not be the future of journalism, but it certainly has created elements which I'm sure other organisations are going to adopt. I just can I just make one point about your suggestion that the conventional media is failing so signally? I think that's a bit harsh. I mean, thinking about America, I'm thinking about the huge expose that the Washington Post did very recently on top secret America. You know, years worth of reporting into the scale of the secret state in America. Staggering piece of reporting. I'm thinking about the New York Times' fantastic stuff on the Guantanamo files. Nearer to home, you know, just thinking about the Guardian for a moment. I mean, we over the last 2 years have had two really major old-fashioned stories. Last year, the Tomlinson, the death of Tomlinson in the G20. Riots, and this year a smaller story which didn't take off but I think was every bit as significant, which was the death of Jimmy Mabenga, who was a asylum seeker who died on a plane while being deported, and the Home Office and the airline said he'd just fallen slightly ill and they'd gone to help him, and in fact it turned out that he'd been very, very heavily restrained. I mention those two stories because in both of those cases the stories came to us via new technologies. In the latter case, Twitter. Well, Twitter was very centrally involved in both, but what we're finding is we're focusing very heavily here on the sort of anonymized whistleblowing. In many cases where people have very important stories to tell, it's not just about the anonymity, it's about getting the word out through a sort of huge network to people who have something to tell you. And I think that's just as exciting as the WikiLeaks phenomenon, and we should be really cheerful about the stuff that old media is doing using new technologies, not
As a common person, the thing that really pisses me off is when you guys sit there and you say, we already knew this stuff, this wasn't news to us, and that says to me, you're not doing your job, because I didn't know that stuff.
Well,
we didn't know that stuff.
Well, I'm sorry, but look, there is an enormous amount of media out there. Okay. It's quite possible that Channel 4 ran a really great couple of stories during the course of this week in its various documentaries. I wouldn't know. I didn't see any of them. And nor would you, because you probably didn't see any of them either. There's an enormous amount of media out there. I'm telling you that, as far as I can see, quite a lot of the stories that were in the cables have been the subject of stories that had already been run in one newspaper or another. Now, you can be as pissed off about that as you like, but unless you are kind of sitting there in the library day after day looking through all the newspapers, you wouldn't necessarily know about it. It comes to a point I was going to make almost before you even said that. Part of the problem that you knock up against is actually the capacity of people to have enough time in their daily lives to imbibe all these stories that you are going to be giving them and make sense of where they stand in relationship both to their lives and to the organisations of the societies around them. And not just their societies, by the way, but also societies which are far less open and far more opaque than our societies tend to be. And that is actually a very, very big question. Will you keep the attention? We asked earlier about Julian Assange, the personality. Why is it? I mean, it's quite interesting because I think there are some people who are talking and saying we shouldn't talk about Julian Assange, the personality, who actually are attracted to this because of Julian Assange, the personality. So there's a kind of strange sort of love thing going on there. But nevertheless, because it's a way in which people can take in information and stories which at some level or other stays with them, and which is which comes in as a level that quite often they feel they want to cope with. They can't cope with. Part of the problem is, even if Ian did have an absolutely slam dunk brilliant story by tomorrow, we've all had enough of it, and we probably wouldn't take it. You might not even see it. You might even not even notice that he'd actually done it. The Times also has had significant scoops over the course of the last 2 or 3 years. You probably don't even know about them because it's all gone.
Or it's because it's behind a paywall.
Well, hold on. It is still possible to buy newspapers, and indeed, it's actually possible to get copies of The Guardian given to you free as you come into Frontline.
G2, just the G2.
Just the G2.
Yeah,
I looked around and thought it might be you, Ian, because I knew you'd be here today, but it was some other guy.
We have another question here.
Yeah, William Horsley, journalist, formerly BBC. I'd like to address a journalistic dilemma that's posed by this kind of huge amount of material, virtually unsolicited. And that is, it touches on what David said earlier about the open democratic world and the closed world. So all this material has come, nearly all the stuff from the latest cables has come from an American society because it's open and because the technology was available. Now, the result is that, you said 700 stories in your newspaper. Many tens of thousands of papers have gone around the world about the inside story of the Americans. Some people say they come out of it smelling quite well. The Figaro even said that. But I think to the great wide world, it mainly comes out that the Americans, are ham-fisted and they're seen as being undermined. Indeed, the argument about WikiLeaks is very bitter, partly because not just governments, but other journalists and people, and Janet Daly would be one example, are incensed that America itself has been betrayed. Certainly Putin has got the NATO battle order in the Baltics and the soft targets of the terrorists we talked about earlier. Ian, how did you attempt? I mean, normally if you're a journalist, you go out to get a story because you think there's a story and you try and put it in the context. How did you attempt to put some kind of context on this?
Well, and I'd like to say we treated every story as though we'd got it in isolation. I certainly applied that test in terms of public interest. I mean, there was a sort of slightly terrifying moment when we were looking at a series of stories that ranged from North Korea, the Chinese cutting the North Korea, or the Americans thinking that the Chinese were going to cut the North Koreans loose, to the Yemenis saying we've been secretly letting the Americans bomb Yemen, and the Saudis telling the Americans to bomb Iran. By the way, a lot of stories here I didn't know, and I read newspapers. Well, I mean, I don't want to. I take David's point, because I mean, what David is really saying, I think, is that the gist of a lot of this stuff we knew, but there is a world of difference between having a rough sense among people who follow Gulf politics closely that the Gulf nations were egging the Americans on to take tougher action on Iran. There's a world of difference between that and the King of Saudi Arabia saying, bomb them, you've got to cut the head off the snake. And then that's where the drama was. So a test that we applied when we were looking at all this stuff and thinking, crikey, we're about to start 3 whole conflicts here, was if we had any one of these individual stories individually, and if it had come to us through traditional sources, because our reporters had gone around seeing sources in Riyadh or Seoul or wherever it was, would we run that story? And that was a very useful tool. I think quite an interesting point is that it felt at times to me like a sort of series of drive-by shootings where any one of the stories we did, I mean, we had one story which we ended up running down page on the front page in the end of week 3, which was about Pfizer hiring private detectives to carry out dirty tricks against the Nigerian Attorney General after a botched drug trial in Nigeria. And under normal circumstances, if we'd got that story, we'd have splashed the whole front page on it and followed it up every day for a week or 2 and chased it maniacally for weeks or maybe months. And there was a quality, which perhaps is what you're getting at here, of there were so many stories in quick succession that it felt like a series of drive-bys in which we didn't sort of wait to check how many kind of corpses were on the ground. And I think that was a difficulty with the scale of it.
But you did provide some context afterwards, because I think it was on the second weekend afterwards, you did that whole inside page, the center page fold-out where you laid out all of the things that were being said about various different countries, and it's sort of, you wanted to get at the totality of it sort of after the fact in some ways.
I think it's a classic case of the smoke's not cleared yet, and it's going to take us
weeks or months to really understand what all those stories were and where they went next.
Well, who's got the mic? And we have some people over here who want the mic. Go ahead.
I was going to say, maybe it's just as well that WikiLeaks and Julian Assange et al. Are not recognized as journalists in the American discussion because given the fate of Al Jazeera journalists and Reuters in certain places in the world. But what I was going to say was, if WikiLeaks was limited to its motto, we open governments, and it was limiting it to countries like Iran, and I came late, so forgive me if you'd covered this, Iran, North Korea, or China, would they be up for a Nobel Prize or even a Pulitzer rather than death threats?
Well, one person's Nobel winner is another person's.
You know, there is a real problem here, and we'll nail it straight away.
Your mic might be covered there.
Yeah, there is not really. For all the people who are friends of Julian Assange talk about it, I don't really assess there as being any real threat to Julian Assange unless it's from a kind of Jared Bochner type. And so on, certainly not from the governments. He's one of the most visible people. Whereas the dissidents in China, you know, they are really in jail just for saying what they say. You know, so we kind of, you know, we just all kind of ought to get that straight. We don't have, and this is no accusation against WikiLeaks, we don't have a Chinese docu-dump. And one of the possible reasons why that would happen is because a Chinese Bradley Manning would not be sitting in jail in solitary confinement.
Let me just suggest something to you that WikiLeaks sits on thousands of pages of Chinese material. Thousands and thousands of pages of that material. And it comes from Chinese dissidents, and no one has ever discovered who they are. And that, hopefully, we'll see that fairly soon. But it's exactly the opposite of what you're suggesting. In point of fact, they're indiscriminate about where they get the material, and it hardly comes from societies in which are only liberal that have this advantage. They're also, I can't even mention some of the other stuff they've got, but it's strong.
Go on.
I know I won't.
Who's up? Why not? Who's got the mic right now in their hands? I can't see. There we go. Can you get that other mic in circulation, please? Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Federica Cocor. I'm a journalist for French website OVNI. I have two questions. One is from someone from Twitter that asked me to...
Can you speak into the mic, please?
Sure. This is the question. How can WikiLeaks as an institution demonstrate that intelligence it collects is not sold on the black market? But I have a question myself, which is kind of different from what we were talking about. But speaking of the media circus, doesn't Julian Assange sometimes play along to it in the sense that, as an example, he sold some pictures of himself to Newsweek. In one of them, he's dressed as Santa Claus. Now, I think that kind of demeans the message a bit, and it distracts. He did some Christmas pictures from Vaughan Smith's house, and he sold them to Newsweek.
Answer.
A freelance photographer did that.
Right. So, okay, so he didn't take them himself,
Yeah,
but
what you're saying is he brings it upon himself.
Exactly. Sometimes I feel like those sort of pictures can distract the message and demean it as well.
And might also demean Santa Claus. What do you think? What do you think? I mean, do you give him media advice, Mark, or just legal advice?
Oh, don't. That's very wise.
Look, I mean, you know, I didn't know about those photographs till they were taken. I don't think they were commercially sold, is my understanding. And you know, if you're playing Santa Claus for kids at Christmas, occasionally there's a photograph. It's a pity that it ended up in a newspaper, but you know, and I can see how cynical journalists might think it was fun, but you know.
Okay, I'm getting the rap cue. I just want to throw one more question at you guys, and it's something that I threw at someone I interviewed on this a couple weeks ago. Imagine that WikiLeaks was launched, say, in the summer of 2000, and it was up and operational in a big way, the way it is today, say on September 11th, 2001. And there was an Anglo-American alliance that was taking their nations to war in the Middle East based on intelligence documents and assessments. Why don't we start with you, Gavin? Had WikiLeaks been up and operational then, do you think that there's an argument to be made that maybe the Iraq War would have never happened?
it's a plausible argument. I mean, because if all the lies were exposed at that point, then I think that people would have taken a better judgment. I don't think there's any doubt of that. With what we know now. The question is, would they have committed a lot of that to paper? I think it's probably very unlikely. Certainly the Rumsfeld conversations were verbal. But there's no doubt that if the public had known half that information, our ability to have gone to war would have been really compromised.
Ian, what do you think?
I think it's a really good question, and I think I'll answer a related but slightly different one, which is that we had a very close version of that question that we asked ourselves, which is that the bit that I found morally trickiest with the cables was the stories about the Yemeni collaboration with the Americans in bombing alleged terrorist targets, where Salah, the Yemeni leader, was saying, "Don't worry, you bomb at will, and then I'll say I did it."
Yeah.
It was a staggering story, but we had various communications with the State Department during this period about the material they were most worried about, and this was very high up on their list of things that they were very worried about, and they made the argument entirely reasonably that this was such an incendiary disclosure that this could jeopardize anti-terror collaboration for them in Yemen, and you can play out the rest of the potential consequences of that. But the question that was then very live to us was, isn't this the exact analogue of what you're talking about, where actually what you've got here is America sleepwalking into another war in Yemen, which its public doesn't know the truth of. And it seemed to me that the case that made the case for publishing that material, it outweighed the security case that the State Department made to us.
I'm sorry we didn't get more questions in. I'm getting.
Can I just say my answer is no. No, because what you'd have seen was the JIC reports that were given to Blair that were you saw during the Butler committee. Actually, Blair himself says that he wished to put out the raw reports as they were, funnily enough, in a kind of WikiLeaks way, and that would have provided a greater justification. You shouldn't believe that knowing everything means that you know what people knew then, that what people didn't know, that you know what people didn't know then. It won't alter.
Give us that again. Just give us that again.
It won't alter history for you. It won't alter the map of ignorance for you.
I want to thank our panelists, Mark Stevens, Gavin MacFayden, David Aaronovitch.
If you don't understand that, you shouldn't be on the platform.
They're going to be here for a few minutes if you want to set about them. All right? Thank you very much.